Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sandy Fowler. I'm the Assistant City Manager for the City of Cedar Rapids, and I've had the pleasure of working with the restoration of these murals over the last several years. So I'm very pleased to welcome you here tonight for the final lecture of our 3-lecture series regarding the mural restoration in our City Hall. I want to take a couple seconds. I know many of you were here for our previous 2 lectures, but for those that you were new, and just to recall, for those that you were here, we started our series in March. We had one in March and one in April, and we've had a number of terrific speakers. Christy Rain, a reference librarian and archivist for Mount Mercy University, and one of our area's most knowledgeable subjects on Grant Wood and the Stone City Art Colony, was here with us in March. What a tremendous lecture she gave us, and I would strongly encourage you to, we have archived these lectures online, and they're available on our website. So what you're hearing here is available for you to go back and listen to, and that first one was really unique information that we learned that night. And also with her that night, and then on the night in April, was Leah Rosen-DeLong, an art historian and guest curator at the University Museums of Iowa State University. And Leah has been working with us for years now on these murals, an expert on post office and courthouse murals. And so she's been with us twice discussing the art that you see before us. And then last month also, we had the great pleasure of having Scott Haskins here. Scott is with the Fine Arts Conservation Laboratories in Santa Barbara, California. And we were able to hire him twice, both for the South Mural and the East Mural Wall, to restore what you see here today. And so having him in town last month, we scheduled our lecture when he was going to be here so that he was able to share with us the technique used to uncover murals like these and the art that you see below them and his experience. So we're excited about this capstone lecture tonight to share with you the fully restored East Mural Wall. While it takes days, as you found out, 2 weeks to uncover the East Mural Wall that Scott Haskins and his team uncovered, it takes months and years to uncover art like this. And so that's what I've been a part of, and I wanted to share just a little bit of information about that with you tonight. The North Mural Wall that you're looking at was uncovered by the General Services Administration of the federal government. Just as we, the city of Cedar Rapids, received this building from the federal government back in 2010. It was always, since the early mid-90s, expected that we were going to trade this building for land that the new federal courthouse sits on today. So we knew that we were going to acquire this property, and in it is what we call a conservation easement. And in one of those elements, it's a lot about historic preservation of the building and things like that, but it also included a caption about the art and our obligation as a city and as a property owner to restore this art. So we have an obligation to raise funds, to try to receive grants and things like that so that we have the opportunity to restore this art. The GSA gave us a little leg up, and we were very appreciative of that, by granting an award to have Page Conservation out of Washington, D.C. restore the mural that you're seeing on the north wall. So at the time that we were renovating this as council chambers, they renovated that, and we were able to open that when we came into this building in the spring of 2011. We actually moved into the building in June of 2012 after a renovation of the entire building, and we encourage you always to come and take a look at the entire structure that is a beautiful restoration of historic buildings. And we're pleased to say that it's a hardworking building, so it's a great use of historic property put back into use, and we're very pleased with that. So the South Mural Wall was our next project, mostly because of the condition of the ceiling, as odd as that sounds. You'll see that the pillars stick out here on the west side. We knew that when we uncovered the mural art, we had to uncover that basically 6 inches of that white space above it, as the artist told us that was really needed to be revealed with the mural art itself. And so we had to raise our ceiling and change lighting and things like that. And so we went to the back wall because we knew how to do it. Sometimes you take the path of least resistance. So we went to that wall to get uncovered, and we have been trying since 2010 to get federal grants to uncover the art, and fairly unsuccessfully for a couple of years, and kept submitting and you're competing against other projects and things like that. We finally decided we couldn't wait any longer, and so on the south wall, we asked a community leader, Tom Aller, step forward and agreed to solicit from other community leaders and organizations funds to help us, what was supposed to be matched for national grants. He successfully raised about $62,000 for us from the local community, from your peers, and we matched that with project dollars. So we were doing the renovation of the whole building. We put some funds toward that to get that south mural uncovered. So then we continued to seek grants, and for the east mural wall, the funding for that has come as Tom was working on raising funds for the south wall. We had the John Reif with the McIntyre Foundation and United Fire came in as part of that effort, and he said, I want to do the entire half of that wall. So from those foundations, both the United Fire Group, Deanne McIntyre, and the McIntyre Foundation, they donated $62,500 toward the restoration of this mural wall. We were lucky enough to finally get an NEA grant worth $20,000 toward the restoration and toward the community conversations that you're a part of today. And then to close the gap, $27,000, we went to the state of Iowa HDRP grant, and we were able to procure that. So as you can see, it's a layering process to find funds for projects like this, and my last pitch will be the west wall. So it's about $100,000, a little bit more than that, to restore the wall. You pay both the renovation person, Scott Haskins, that kind of a person, to do the renovation of the wall, and then we have that little bit of ceiling and plaster work and lighting work. So it's about $100,000. We have a City Hall mural fund set up at the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation. You can, anyone can give donations to that if you know of companies that might be interested. I'm certainly interested in meeting with people who are need to have somebody talk to them about how that works and things like that. So if you have any leads for me, I'm sure open to that. We're eager to get that west wall uncovered as well. We feel like we're on a roll, and it would be fun to get that opened up. So I will. I invite you. I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, and then after the lecture, we invite you to stick around, wander around a little bit, see the murals. Once you get to know them a little bit better through Sean's presentation, we invite you to take a look and chat around, so you don't have to rush off right away. So I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. Sean Ulmer is the executive director of the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. He has more than 20 years of curatorial experience, including organizing over 120 exhibitions and acquiring numerous works of art. Prior to his position at CRMA, he was the curator of modern and contemporary art at the University of Michigan Museum of Art from 2001 to 2005. Scott received a BA in art history from the University of Toledo Museum of Art, and an MA in art history from the Ohio State University. We're pleased to have Sean here tonight, and thank you all for coming.
Can you hear me? This is work. Okay, it's working. I'm going to stand over here at this podium, which is skeletal at best, so that you can look beyond me at the mural that we're going to be talking about today. I've also brought a boatload of slides for you to look at for comparison's sake. And you'll see those on the various monitors around as well as up there, but you may want to kind of reposition yourself to see some of the comparative material. How many were here for the first two lectures? Okay, all right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of history behind how these murals and murals like them were produced in the 30s. First, as a result of the Depression, President Roosevelt created a whole series of programs under the umbrella of the New Deal. One of those programs was the Public Works of Art Project, which was responsible for mural production. But that was a very, very short-lived project. It only ran from December of 33 until July of 34. And as soon as that ended, a lot of the artists who were working under the Public Works of Art Project switched over to the TRAP project, which is the Treasury Relief Art Project, and this is a trap project. So it comes actually under the auspices of the Treasury Department. And that ran from July of 35 until June of 39. So it was a 4-year program, and it was a program to put artists to work, to have them have an income, and to create works that would be in the public realm and enjoyed by everyone. One of the artists that sort of jumped on the opportunity was Francis Robert White, who succeeded Ed Rowan as the head of the Little Gallery here in Cedar Rapids. And White was the supervising artist of Iowa's trap projects. So he sort of oversaw all of the trap projects, and he was one of the people who worked on this mural. In fact, White is responsible for the North mural. That's his work. He also was responsible for kind of heading up a group of local artists who worked on murals, and he gathered them together to work on this series of murals, he doing one of them and then other artists doing the other ones. These 4 murals, 3 of which you can see and the 4th of which Sandy's extolling you to fundraise for. I can't think of a more worthwhile cause unless it was the Museum of Art. There's the plug. There you go. Okay, now that that's out of the way. We have 2 murals that are 48 feet wide and 2 murals that are 60 feet wide. And the East mural that we'll be talking about tonight is one of those longer murals that are 60 feet wide. All of the murals are 5.5 feet tall. As I mentioned, Francis Robert White is the author of the North mural, and that deals with the conquest, expansion, and development of the West, and that's the theme that you see there. On the south wall, that's Harry Donald Jones, and we talked about that last time, and that really explores various subjects around inherited culture. On the east wall, which was done by Everett Jeffrey, the theme is lynch law versus the settled tribunal and superstition versus science. And then the west wall, that you cannot see yet, was done by Howard Johnson. And it focused on community service and has images such as firemen, police, early cooperative store, work relief offices. And I think that Seth has created a PowerPoint of what that wall looks like through old photographs that he'll be showing after tonight's presentation. So before you leave, do take a look. It'll be flashing on the screen. You'll see what that wall looks like, at least in black and white from old black and white photographs. So, and then there was a 5th artist, Don Glassell, who was responsible for the half roundels on both the east and west wall. So these roundels that you see right here, and there are some over there as well. And he was responsible for those. So let's see if this works from this distance. I kind of think it won't. Oops, too fast. So who is Everett Jeffrey? Everett Jeffrey was a native of Oxford Mills, Iowa. Does anyone know where Oxford Mills, Iowa is? It's south of Oxford Junction, Iowa. It's on the Wapsipinicon, and he spent part of his childhood there, and then the family moved to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. And then while still young, they returned to Iowa, and he resided with his family until his artistic career took off. He's largely self-taught and was heavily promoted by Ed Rowan of the Little Gallery and had a number of group and solo shows here in the area. He attended the Stone City Art Colony for at least 1 year, and in 1932 he joined the group called the Cooperative Mural Painters Group of Cedar Rapids, which is the group that White organized. And later in life, after the completion of this mural and other projects, he moved on to Little Rock and then to Phoenix and eventually settled in Honolulu, where he passed away in 1983. I'm going to have to move. Don't look at me at all now. Just look at the mural. I need to get closer to where I can do the clicker here. Okay. Here's shortly after the mural was completed, I snuck over here to get an early look at it because I didn't, have anything to base any of my comments on because it had been covered up for so many years. And so when I got here, the conservators had left already, but the scaffolding was still up. So you'll see some shots that I have here of the mural with the scaffolding up. And it's terrible for photography, but it does give you an advantage, because if you talk to the right people and you talk to them nicely enough, they let you climb that scaffolding and you get up very close to the work, which is something that we're not able to do here, but it does allow for some interesting shots that I got after climbing the somewhat treacherous scaffolding. Should not be, oops, okay. So I thought, I have to be patient with this clicker. Okay. So I thought I would share with you some of those detailed shots and basically progress our way across the mural from left to right. This section of the mural was actually supposed to be called free speech. And there's no free speeching going on here at all. But that is how it was described in the official book on these projects that was called the Art in Federal Buildings book. Something somewhere along the line changed, because what we're seeing here is not free speech, but we're seeing much more sort of economic activity. You've got a farmer against silos. You've got somebody with a blowtorch working, and you've got a man in a tie seated at a desk behind which looks to be a kind of stock market listing. But the man himself, I contend, is not affiliated with the stock market. There we go. Because when you can get in closer to it, he's actually looking at a blueprint. He's working on a blueprint, and it looks like it almost may even be a design for an airplane. When you get to looking at the details of it and the rounded form. So it doesn't have anything to do with the stock market, although I think the chart behind him definitely does. So it's a variety of different economic activities that are depicted here, none of which have really any direct tie to free speech. So somewhere along the way, the actual subject matter of this section changed, and it's not reflected in the official handbook on these public works projects. Then we come to our first lunette. And this is probably the work of Don Glassell, according to what our records show us. And here you see this sort of closed book with a bookmark hanging out of it. And what's very, very curious, I think, is if you look at it, it looks like a closed book, but then if you actually look at the spine, which is right here, you see where the spine of the book actually is. So from the side, it looks like it's an open book. But when you look at it from the top, it looks like it's a closed book. So somewhere along the way, Glassell changed the way in which this depiction reads, because there is definitely this little bit of spine area right there. It looks like it would be an open book, but then it also has a cover completely across the top of it. This air ventilation system was there, and he had to work around that. So he needed to communicate what he was depicting with very little surface to work with. And so, because that grading was there, and it appears in all of the old photographs. It's original to the building. So he had to work around that opening. That was the only way in which the space was heated and ventilated. And now we come to the $1,000,000 scene, the hanging, the lynching. It is the scene that was pointed to most often in the reason for covering up the murals in the first place. Remember, this was a courtroom, and the judge sat right up there, and the jury sat right over here, where the jury box is still, and a number of lawyers and other judges who worked in this space thought that perhaps a scene of a hanging was inappropriate in a courtroom, that it might bias the jury in some way or another. And that was the reason given for painting over the murals the first time, was that it was an inappropriate subject matter. But I will discuss in more detail later why it is quite appropriate for a courtroom, and why other artists were showing this same subject matter in various public murals in the country. Here's the detail, and you can see it was very detailed, and there had been some speculation until the murals were uncovered. There was some speculation that the lynching was of an African American, and it's absolutely not. And that's one thing that the removal of the outer paint layer has made clear to us. But you can see that he included the little post office, image of a post office there. And this whole scene is taking place with clapboard buildings, kind of a sense of a bit of the Wild West still in the imagery, and that's on purpose because it's actually going to be contrasted against the next scene. But there are some details here that are worth taking a look at. This is one. When you get up close to the mural, and it's very hard to see from the ground, but when you're on the scaffold hanging on for dear life, it's not so hard to see that there's this sort of a marking on the saddle that the man is situated on. And for a long time, I kept looking at this OT, and figuring out what kind, is that some sort of maker's mark? Was that a specific manufacturer of saddles? And I looked all over, because Iowa has areas in Iowa that were very, very well known for leatherworking and for saddle making. And Burlington, Iowa, for one example, had a very, very sophisticated leatherworking company. And I thought, well, maybe there's some sort of local tie, some sort of local reference there. But that search turns up nothing. I could not find it. Anytime you find saddles that are decorated with logos or company names on them, they tend to be very, very elaborately worked leather goods. This is a very, very simple saddle, but has this marking on it. And then the longer I looked at this, and maybe it was late at night, and maybe I'd had one glass too many, but I swear that there's a D in front of the OT. And it's just very faint, it's very lightly there, but I want to see it there. And so I thought, so then I did all kinds of searches on dot saddles, and you would not believe it, there are actual horse saddles that are covered in dots. Covered in painted dots. They look horrible. They just look horrible, but they're out there. So if you ever want to know, you can Google that and see more than you ever thought you would. But I could not find anything that tied into OT or DOT. And so that just made me think, maybe it's a reference to the Department of Treasury, because they were the funders of the project. That's just a wild guess, but certainly sort of fits that is a very deliberate and not an accidental series of letters. And so it must mean something. And in lack of finding out what it really, really means, and we'll leave that to future generations of scholars, I think that for right now I'm content to say it's the Department of Treasury. Because just below that, I think I have that in the next slide, just below that, in the same scene, the hot button scene, if you will, he signs his name, he dates the work to 1936, and he writes TRAP, the Treasury Relief Art Project. So he is definitely acknowledging the source of the funds for the creation of the entire mural cycle right there in that scene. And I think he well knew that would be the scene that people would be looking at. And so that's why he put his name there, first of all. I mean, he could have signed anywhere, but he signed under the hanging. Again, it's a very, very conscious decision on his part. And that scene is countered with this scene. And this scene is really a comparison scene. If the first scene is about vigilantes and a lynching, the second scene is about dispersing of the mob that are kind of looking to get their own form of justice. But it's a show of what a civilized society will do to anyone who's accused of a crime. Rather than taking justice into their own hands and doing a lynching, instead, this is justice that's served out through proper channels, the proper channels that would happen in a courtroom. So it's actually an exemplar of what kind of justice should be happening in a courtroom. And so you see, maybe, you see the accused, handcuffed, being protected by law enforcement and being escorted to the courtroom. the courthouse that stands behind him. And the mob is being controlled by this very fascist-looking policeman with a machine gun. And that certainly would control a mob, I suppose. But you see that it's about the separation. It's about keeping the mob from taking justice into their own hands. And you know this is the courthouse because, of course, it has a wonderful eagle on the pediment. You know, it has all the classical courthouse, and and I actually started looking around to see if there was a courthouse in town that had an eagle on it. I did not find one. But I do think that he was looking around town for a lot of his source imagery in this case. And one example of that, I think, is this little light that you see here. I mean, this is definitely, it's in a city. We're no longer dealing with clapboard buildings. It's no longer the old sort of Wild West approach. This is a settled city, a civilized city. You've got your brick and masonry buildings. You've got this wonderful series of street lights. It's electrified. And I wondered if some of those street lights weren't really inspired by street lights that he could very easily have seen here in Cedar Rapids. Here's 4 postcards. Early postcards of Cedar Rapids, where you see very similar light forms. There are lights attached to the original fountain in Green Square, which show lights with 5 globes. The one that's depicted in the Jeffrey mural only has 3, but I think that there are also 3 light globes there on 3rd Avenue and in front of Armstrong's. So I think that he would not have had to go far to incorporate something that he could see right here in Cedar Rapids into his mural. Here's the second lunette, and here you're looking at 2 tablets, the 10 Commandments, one of the earliest forms of law that would have been appropriate in a courtroom setting, although we know from recent times there's been a lot of controversy with having the 10 Commandments in a courthouse setting. But in the 30s, in 1936-37, when this was created, it was seemed appropriate. Next, we move on to superstition versus science, which is just like the prairie law versus civilized law is set up as a contrast. And so in the left-hand side of the scene, you see various forms of what they call superstitious science, different forms of healing that were considered unscientific. Here's a man mixing chemicals together to create this healing sort of smoke. There's another man who's laying hands on somebody who is in the posture of prayer, but yet also has this bottle next to her, probably some sort of potion or liquid that was also supposed to help in the healing process. We have here Native Americans in their healing process, and when you get up close to it, it's very interesting to see that he included in here the wonderful little swastika symbol, which is a symbol that before the Nazis took hold of it, had a very rich history dating all the way back to the earliest civilizations in mankind, and had different meanings for different groups, but was very, very common amongst the native peoples of America, specifically the prairie Indians, the plains Indians, the Dakota, the Lakota, and so you see it figuring frequently. Here is an example of a basketball team, 1908 and 09. A Native American basketball team, which this form, this swastika form, before being corrupted, was really very much a part of their identity. So he, having lived, on an Indian reservation in his youth, was probably well familiar with the symbols, Native American symbols that he would have encountered on a daily basis as a child, and incorporated them on the side of the TB that you see in the background. Then there's these weird duck men. What the heck to do with those guys? They are also kind of superstitious slash charlatan. They're actually, as you can see, kind of dressed up to look with the little lace collars and this weird duck coverings. These are actually Renaissance plague doctors. These were doctors who would tend to people during the plague as if they could cure people during the plague. And we know that because we have extant prints. Here, 17th century prints of Renaissance plague doctors that were widely dispersed. This is how they were dressed. Wearing this kind of hood, they felt protected them from the plague. And then they would, exact a lot of money from you to promise you a cure from the plague. And then, of course, you died, so how could you complain about it, right? And you didn't need the money anymore anyhow. So this is, and it's this kind of costume that the term quackery comes from. So these are quacks. These are quack doctors because it just as an extension of these duck-billed hoods. So this is where quackery comes from. And then there's this wonderful little transition element underneath the vent here. This again sort of really supports the fact that the vents were in place, and here the artist is reacting specifically to their placement by creating this sort of nice divide between the two compositions, and leading you into what is the operating room, the true science, and the superiority of science over superstition. And we've got an image here of surgery. And it has several details in it, including the X-ray machine, and a detail of some sort of operation that's happening on this young child. It's hard to determine whether that child is still alive or not. Looks pretty inactive there. Maybe it's just a lot of ether. Who knows? And then the mechanicals of the operating room, the X-ray of what appears to be very distinctly an African-American individual, and then Glasel's third lunette here with scrolls. I can't make out what the left hand says. It starts out to say CEAC, but I can't figure out what that is supposed to reference. The right-hand scroll clearly says law. So I've not been able to determine what the reference is in the left-hand scroll at all, but the right is quite clear. And then we come to the mess, okay? The mess at the end. This end is actually supposed to be representing the movies, all right? That's what it says in the book. That's what it says in the Art in Federal Buildings book. But this is not a representation, as far as I can tell, of the movies. We have a woman surrounded by newspapers, and then two men, one apparently a doctor, and one his patient, in this sort of weird blue lozenge. And it's interesting because we have to wait, I think, on some level, and I'll give you plenty of theories about this one, but we'll have to wait on some level to see what the west wall turns out to be, because when you look at the photographs of the west wall, the one that's not uncovered yet, the two ends are also misidentified. The one that on the far left was supposed to be Popular Education, the press, but actually represents a community cooperative store. And the one on the far right was actually supposed to be a return to labor, but actually represents a brutal war scene. This one here on the left looks more potentially like a return to labor. And with the newspapers over here, one might be able to make the argument that this is Popular Education, the press. However, there are some details of that sort of go against that. And one wonders if there wasn't sort of a flip-flop. Now, we don't have the movies, and we don't have free speech, as were originally described here. But it is interesting that the misidentified corners on the west wall bear some relationship to what we find in the corners on the east wall. What throws this out a little bit is the fact that these two are such disjointed scenes. What does the woman with the newspapers have to do with these two medical figures? And part of that is described a little bit in one of the newspapers. One of the newspapers says, "Sweden defeats syphilis." So there's a certain science in that headline, but why she is amongst this sea of papers and why these two figures, whether that represents syphilis or not, is completely unclear. And it's not as if all the newspapers deal with science. In fact, the one down below says "play ball" with a baseball player in it. So it's a real diverse group of newspapers here. So it doesn't clearly say science, although the small lozenge-shaped scene seems to say that. But when they were cleaning the mural, they found out that section with the newspapers was gone. It had been cut out. It was gone. And they were afraid, because that's one of the places where they started, they were afraid that there were other things that were missing and cut out. But it turns out that was the only section of the mural that was cut out, and we can't really explain that. We know that the murals were covered over. But why would someone go to the trouble of trying to cut out a section? And why just that section with the newspapers? Was there something else that was underneath there? Was it not newspapers originally? Because we really don't know what was originally there, because when we went to take it off, there's nothing there. We have old photos, but we don't know, whether that was specifically what Jeffrey's intent was, or whether that was some sort of later adaptation. So it was the conservators who painted back in a very loose and different style, those newspapers based on the most information that we had, which were the historic photos. So we brought it back to the way in which we know it existed at one point in time. And here, Sandy, here's where you get your money back, okay? If you look very closely at some of those papers, you never see it unless you're up on a scaffolding. Somewhere up there, it actually says, "Scott loves Diana forever," okay? And that has to be Scott Haskins, okay? And Diana must be his love. And so the conservator took a small liberty in including his own name in a part of the modern reapplication, and I bet you he doesn't think anybody knows that. Yeah, and it's up there. Yeah. I mean, it's very, very pale, but you can see it right. You can't see it on that screen, but it's probably right up there, right underneath the exit sign. Yeah. So I said, well, now I know that wouldn't have been in a newspaper, "Scott loves Diana forever." So someone had to have added that little tidbit in there. But now it's part of the history of the piece now, very much so. Amazing the things you see when you really look hard and are clinging on for dear life. So I just kind of stitch these together. These are the historic photos, and I just kind of overlaid one over the other so that you can kind of see how we last knew this to be, how we last knew with the newspapers in them. And you can see that they used these to approximate how the newspapers played out around the figures. But of course, if you do some research, you do find a few interesting things. I found the newspaper that said "Sweden defeats syphilis." It's the Chicago Tribune, dated on, sadly enough, February 14th, of all days, 1937. So no, what else do you talk about on Valentine's Day but syphilis? Okay, as your headline. Sort of seems odd, but that is the actual newspaper. It was the Tribune. And it is the headline, and it's generally laid out in very much the way that the newspaper was. So whoever painted this, presumably Jeffrey, was using the Tribune as his source, as his guide there. And so I've started looking through the Tribune for the 14th of February in 37. And there's another newspaper here that has a different story, another page of the same newspaper that looks somewhat like one of the pages that's down below. I think, where are we? There we are. This one down here. in the photographs. If you look at the old black and white photographs, this one, which is only generally put in, has the same sort of distribution of photos on the page as this page, but I couldn't find anything else. You'd think I could find something that says play ball, okay? Trouble is I found 100,000 things that say play ball, okay? And trying to find one with that really wonderful photograph of that baseball player jumping into the air to catch the ball, that would jump out at me, trust me. But after hours of looking for a play ball page, I couldn't find it. So I'll leave it to those of you who have perhaps a little more time than I do to search through, and I would start with the Tribune, but I wouldn't limit myself there. But search through, find the play ball, because what's nice about this, even though he dated the mural 36, this tells us that at least this part was done after February 14, 37. And the other murals are both dated 36, 37. So it's very much in keeping that these murals were all being worked on at the same time, simultaneously, by 5 different artists. And that while he just dated his 36, I think it's certainly stretched into early 37 based on this evidence. And then here's this wonderful little lozenge, and it's sort of odd. It ties in with the whole medical idea, but keep in mind that when we looked at prairie justice versus civilized justice, and we looked at superstition versus medicine, they really occupy that center section. The ends were something separate and distinct. There's nothing that compels us to look at that right-hand corner and link it automatically to medicine or science, even though we just left that subject matter. It could relate to anything, and so while it certainly looks like a doctor and a patient, I mean, how else do you explain a lot of this? I think there's a lot of research that has to happen still to figure out what this really represents. And I was just determined to make that Albert Schweitzer. I was so determined. But 1936, 37 were not hallmark years for Schweitzer. And he was off doing his work in Africa, and he was working mostly with Africans, and he did do some work in syphilis, but there were many other things that he was working on at the same time, and long before he won the Nobel Peace Prize, long before that. And I just wanted to see it because I see that just the palest indication of a beard and a very bushy mustache. Now, of course, he was famous for his bushy mustache, but not for a beard. But I was just sort of extrapolating or projecting what I wanted this to be, and to try and get some sort of sense out of this. And he certainly was he was more than just a scientist. He was a great musician, and he was very famous, and he was written about a lot in newspapers. And I was trying to link it more to images of the newspaper rather than specifically to science. So what do? I talked a little bit about the connection between the lynching scene and the civilized justice. And justice in murals was not an uncommon theme in mural projects. In fact, the Department of Justice, not surprisingly, is filled with murals. Has over 50 murals in its wall. So if you go to the Department of Justice, and I don't know that you can actually get in, but if you go to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., it's a wonderful series of murals all over. They spent a lot of money as a part of this project working on murals, and murals that all dealt with the theme of justice. And one of those, obviously they were all about how justice and law improves people's lives. That's really what it's about. And one of those artists who received a commission was John Steuart Curry. And he received a very big commission there. He created a 2-mural set called Law versus Mob Violence. That was the one that dealt specifically with the law. But this one that you see here first is the expansion and the movement westward, which is basically what our North Wall talks about. So what Curry did in one mural, we kind of do in this long mural, and in the other mural, we have justice, law versus mob violence that you see here in this image. I'm going to get closer to it. It's in a very prominent position. It's above the library in the Justice Department. And on the one side, you see this mob, this lynch mob. You see it's led by a man in a cowboy hat. with a noose, or at least a lasso, which will presumably become a noose. And you see these dogs being held back. But in the background, you see two girls having a really nice time. They're in party dresses. They're just sort of there. And then coming in from the left-hand side, a very dapper man in a white linen suit and a boater coming. So it really cut across all segments. It's not about the Wild West. It's not about just the cowboys and prairie, but prairie justice. But rather, it's saying that this is everybody. Everybody is capable of being a part of a mob. And then here's the accused who is being protected by the judge. I mean, it's very, very clear that it's unequivocal. And then there are the police there to the side, but he is there. But in both cases, in the perpetrator with the rope and the man who's accused, their heads are concealed. The perpetrator's concealed with a scarf, and the man with the noose, his head is turned away, because they represent every man. Anybody is possible being the ringleader of a mob or being the accused one. And it's a reminder that you can play either one of those roles or be in either one of those roles yourself. Thomas Hart Benton also dealt with issues of social justice, most notably in this series of murals that he did in 1936 for the Missouri State Capitol, called A Social History of the State of Missouri. There are 13 panels that represent 235 individuals, all of which have different features. There are a couple of small insets in this series. I'm just sort of giving you an overall. It's kind of like our murals on steroids. Okay. Here's two insets. On the left, upper left, you have an image of the slavery mistreatment in the lead mines of Missouri. And lower right, you see the expulsion of the Mormons. They didn't care for the Mormons, and they got rid of them. They burned their houses down, and you can see to the far right that they're tar and feathering a Mormon. This is another mural in that same suite, and we're going to look at a couple of different images from it. Here, the center portion, and just to the left of that, you see a farmer behind a horse on a plow, and in the far, far distance, you see these dark clouds that have been likened to the dark clouds of the Civil War as it impacted Missouri. But if you look very, very closely, in the fire that causes those clouds, there's actually a lynched man hanging off of a gallows. There's also scenes of violence and lawlessness that you see here. There's they're robbing people, not robbing the train, they're robbing the people around the train. And that is actually juxtaposed with a courtroom scene. Not of those particular bandits, but just the sense of lawlessness versus a courtroom-based law. And interestingly enough, as another analogy, the newspaper reviews for this mural series was very favorable, but all of the reporters worried what the legislators would think when they came back from break. And they were right. Immediately, they wanted to cover over the murals. That's what the legislators wanted to do. They thought the subject matter, the largeness of the figures, the bright colors, and all the people who wanted to come see them were antithetical to carrying on matters at the Capitol. Benton himself held a number of public question and answer sessions to explain his murals, and newspapers from across the country actually came out for and against. Tulsa came out against the murals, Chicago came out for the murals, so it actually got picked up in the national press. Of course, Benton was quite famous by this time. He had been living and working in New York for many, many years, and the fact that he returned to Missouri was considered, turning his back on New York. So they were watching what he was going to do when he went back to his home state. By the summer of '37, when the legislature broke for the summer, the furor was completely gone. Everyone had had their say. I guess it's the Missouri way. Everyone had had their say, and then there was no more of it. But they had even tried to enact laws or acts to get this thing covered up. because they felt it was inappropriate in the Capitol building. And then there are other murals that just represent lynching, that aren't really about two different forms of justice, but are just about lynching. This is Joe Jones, and this is called The Struggle of the South. It was a mural done for Commonwealth College in Mena, Arkansas in 1935, and very, very interesting style for that period. He investigates the miseries of sharecropping, lynching, and the plight of coal miners in Arkansas. And he said, I'm not interested in painting pretty pictures to match pink and blue walls. I want to paint things that knock holes in walls. And I think he certainly did in this representation. Interestingly enough, he painted this in 2 weeks. In August of 1935, he was paid a whopping $50. And it was 3 walls that totaled 44 feet in length and 8.5 feet in height. Commonwealth, despite the fact of underpaying the artist by only paying him $50, ended up closing in 1940. And the mural was dismantled and actually used by someone else to build a house. They actually took the mural off the walls and used them as house walls. In 1984, it was bought by the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, where it was stored until 2009 and is now being restored. And this is an image of one of the portions that have been restored from that series that shows, in a very dramatic fashion, in very bright colors as well, a lynching scene. And that whole mural dealt really with miseries of Arkansas. Of living in Arkansas. So this next section deals really with medicine in murals. Just like justice was a fairly common theme in murals, medicine was as well. And we're going to go way out west here. We're going to go to California to look at the murals of Bernard Zachem, who did a series of murals called The History of Medicine in California. It was for the University of California at San Francisco Medical Center, where they are still today. And he did them in 1935-36, which is really the same time period that we're talking about here. Ours are from 36-37. There's a number of murals in 2 different halls there. One in Cole Hall that were done in 1935 juxtaposes rational medicine and superstitious medicine. They are large, 75 by 90 inches. Jumping ahead of myself. So here is an image of superstitious medicine. You can see everyone from Jewish elders to monks of the Middle Ages, to people who are worshiping the zodiacal signs, and everyone trying to heal a variety of people with different problems, compared to surgery. Okay, compared to medicine and surgery. So in some ways, very, very similar in concept to the themes that we have in our murals here. William C. Palmer also did a series of murals. Palmer, interestingly enough, was born in Des Moines. Moved to New York when he graduated from high school, studied under Benton in New York, and then in France, and studied fresco, actually in France. Then created this mural, The Development of Medicine, not this one, but the one I'm going to show you next, in 1938 for the Elmhurst Hospital Center in New York City. And after that, he kind of landed in Utica, New York, where he was the founder and director of the Munson Williams Proctor School of Art from 1941 until his retirement in 1973. So he was there for some 32 years. Here we see him actually working on a large panel. And interestingly enough, on that panel you see another one of our quacks. You see another one of our Renaissance plague doctors to the right-hand side there, wearing his little beaked hood and hat. But here's the image that he did for the Elmhurst Hospital Center that is 75 by 90 inches. And again, it's a scene of surgery. And he was interviewed for the Archives of American Art. And then afterwards, he didn't like the way he sounded. So he added an addendum to that archives. And he said, and this is speaking specifically about this mural, the development of medicine, said, to put the record straight, the mural Development of Medicine was painted to show the ignorance, superstition, and fear of uncontrolled medicine, the great historical contributions and discoveries which lead up to the scientific and enlightened medicine and hospital care of the 30s, as shown in controlled medicine. The theme of this panel shows the equipment, etc., used by hospital in prevention of disease and treatment of the patient. Socialized medicine was not in my vocabulary in 1936, and certainly in doing my research for the work, it was never considered or mentioned by any hospital authority. The real purpose of the murals at Queens, which is where this is, was to serve two main purposes. One, to give the waiting patients in the incoming and outgoing patient rooms something to look at and to inform them of the history and background of treatment. And two, Dr. Kogel, the superintendent at Queens, used the panels in his lectures to student nurses on the history of medicine. So he saw them really as being very, very didactic, to be both for the patients and for instruction as well. And I think that on some level, all of the murals that you're looking at are both for, for your visual pleasure, but also to be used as instruction. To learn from. And it's very much how those pairings of justice and science are established, so that you can compare and contrast what things were and what things are, and see the progress that's made. I just want to close with a series of images by Thomas Hart Benton again. If you find yourself on your way to New York City anytime soon, they have installed on the main floor in the American wing the entire series of murals that Benton did called America Today. They're from the early 30s, and I think there's some interesting relationships to our murals here. They are installed exactly as they had been installed when they were first made. They were not made for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They were actually made for a boardroom for the New School of Social Research. And then in 1982, when they realized that they really couldn't care for them any longer, they sold them to Equitable Life, known also as AXA, who had them on display in their lobby on 7th Avenue. And then recently, in 2012, they donated the murals to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who has installed them in this fashion. There are 8 panels that depict different regions of the United States, and including the South, the Midwest, the West, and of course, New York City. And they have a number of interesting comparisons, I think, to our murals. Not to say that the artists working on our murals in any way, shape, or fashion were looking to Benton or Benton's murals for inspiration, but that the fact that things appear in Benton's murals and things appear in our murals bespeak of a general consensus of ideas and thoughts about the kinds of things that make up America and are to be depicted in murals. The largest is this, the Instruments of Power, where you see the train, you can see the plane, you can see the mechanics, you can see electricity, you can see a dirigible, and it's interesting to kind of look at these images around and see some of these same images of power in our murals. Here, the West, the Midwest, and the South are all sort of together on one wall. Here's, for example, a specific image of the West. And what Benton did, which I think is sort of interesting, all the muralists endeavored to show multiple scenes, but on one field. So how do you separate those scenes? If you look at White's wall up here, you see very clear, distinct color separations. You know where one scene begins and another one. It's a little jarring, but they try to find different kinds of elements to separate them. In White's case, there's one thing that sort of ends, whether it's a tree trunk or the edge of a machine, that sort of demarcates a division, a separation into another scene. You stitch it together. In Jeffrey's wall, he has certain divisions that are automatic in there. The ventilation system, for one, breaks up the space for him, and he can work around that, or he can work against it. And he chose to work around that and around the doorway openings, and so there's a little bit more sort of fluidity between the scenes. And if you look at the south wall, the Jones wall, you see that there are certain devices that are used to separate, whether it's the scaffolding or one of the monuments from Mexico or what have you. But there are also some sort of elements that are a little bit jarring, and all mural artists working on a very long horizontal plane needed to find some way to separate their spaces so they can tell you different stories and different scenes. Benton did it by using a piece of molding of aluminum leaf molding that he had that sort of comes down, swoops down, and goes nowhere. But it